You already know how this story ends. Chains, a whip, a pyramid rising while you die underneath it. Except none of that happened. Not to you. Your body was never property in the way you think. Your labor was. That distinction is about to matter more than you expect. What if the version of slavery you were taught in school is almost entirely wrong? Start with your birth. In ancient Egypt, somewhere around 3,000 years ago, being born poor didn't mean being born a slave. It meant being born into a system of categories, and the category you landed in decided almost everything about the shape of your life. There was the hem, a servant bound to a household or a temple estate. There was the back, someone captured in war and legally owned as property. And there was you, most likely, a free peasant who owed a set number of weeks of labour to the state each year and owed nothing at all the rest of the time. That obligation had a name too. Historians call it corvée labour, a kind of tax paid in sweat instead of coin. Here's the part that destabilizes the whole myth you grew up with. The pyramids were not built by chained masses dragged from a slave market. Archaeologist Zahi Hawass and Egyptologist Mark Lehner uncovered an entire workers' village at Giza in the 1990s, buried under sand for 4,500 years. It had bakeries. It had breweries capable of producing thousands of litres of beer a day. It had a cemetery reserved specifically for the men who built the pyramid, positioned close enough to the monument that anyone walking past would understand these were not disposable bodies. Isotope analysis of the skeletons told an even stranger story than the buildings did. These men ate beef regularly. In Bronze Age Egypt, beef was a luxury food, closer to a steak dinner than a bowl of gruel, reserved for people the state wanted fed well. Does that sound like slavery to you? It didn't sound like it to the researchers either, and it forced a quiet rewriting of one of the most repeated stories in human history. So if not the pyramid builders, who actually was enslaved? That's where the picture turns darker and more specific. War captives, mostly Nubian and Libyan men brought back after military campaigns, became true legal property. They could be sold. They could be inherited like furniture. They could be worked without wage in mines and stone quarries far from any village that would remember their names. Some ended up in the gold mines of Nubia, described centuries later by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus as places where men laboured chained in near total darkness until their bodies simply gave out under the strain. That account was almost certainly accurate, and it was only one layer of a much larger, much stranger system. Because unlike nearly every other slave-owning civilization in the ancient world, an Egyptian Bak could still own property. He could marry a free woman. He could appear in court and testify, and have that testimony matter. Given enough time, enough luck, and enough saved grain, he could even buy his own freedom outright. Legal papyri recovered from the workers' town of Deir el-Medina record exactly this kind of transaction. Ordinary contracts written by ordinary scribes, documenting people negotiating their own value like any other commodity in the marketplace. Slavery here was never a single, fixed cage with one door. It was a spectrum, and where you landed on it could shift more than once across a single lifetime. There's another detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this history. Egyptian law even recognized something close to a formal adoption contract for servants, allowing a childless household to legally absorb a hem into the family line, granting inheritance rights that a stranger off the street could never claim. A surviving document known as the Adoption Papyrus, now held in the British Museum, records exactly this kind of arrangement. A woman formally adopting her own servants so they could inherit her property after her death. Try imagining that inside a Roman villa, or on a plantation 2,000 years later. It simply doesn't translate, because the categories don't map onto each other the way modern imagination assumes they should.
Now picture a specific day, because this is where the story stops being an abstraction and becomes a scene you can actually see. It's year 29 of the reign of Ramses III, roughly 1152 BC, inside the walled village of Deir el-Medina on the west bank of the Nile. You are a laborer here, not a slave, employed directly by the state to carve and paint the tombs of kings inside the Valley of the Kings. Your wages arrive in grain, delivered on a fixed schedule you have relied on your entire working life. This month, the delivery doesn't come. Your children are hungry. Your foreman has no answer for you, because even he doesn't know why the storehouses have gone quiet. So you put down your chisel. You are not alone in doing it. Dozens of men across the village make the same decision on the same afternoon, and together, without a single sword drawn, you walk. Past the guarded gates, past the silent mortuary temples, straight toward the funerary complex of the king himself, the most sacred and most heavily protected ground in the entire kingdom. You sit down in the open sun, and you wait. The heat presses down on the back of your neck. Somewhere behind you, a child cries, because there is nothing left in the storeroom to feed him. No one moves to arrest you. No one raises a weapon. The guards simply watch, unsure what to do with men who are supposed to be humble servants of the state, acting like they have standing to demand anything from it at all. A scribe named Amenachte writes down exactly what happens next on a papyrus that somehow survives 3,000 years, now sitting in a museum in Turin and known simply as the Turin Strike Papyrus. It documents the earliest labor strike in recorded human history. Sit with what that actually means for a second. 3,000 years before unions existed, before a single labor law had ever been written, before anyone on earth had a word for workers' rights, a group of ordinary Egyptian craftsmen organized themselves, walked off the job, and confronted the most powerful religious and political institution on the planet. And it worked. Within days, rations were delivered. The strike ended not in mass punishment, but in negotiation and partial concession from the state itself. That is not what slavery looks like, in any society, in any century. Slaves do not organize sit-ins outside a king's temple. Slaves do not negotiate with pharaohs. And they certainly do not win. Here is the twist, the one that should genuinely unsettle everything you thought you knew coming into this. The myth of Egypt, built entirely by slave labor, doesn't come from any Egyptian source at all. It comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing nearly 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was already finished, repeating second-hand rumors he collected while touring Egypt as a curious foreign visitor. He never watched a single block being placed. He never interviewed a single builder. He wrote down a story that felt plausible to a Greek audience back home, and that story calcified into accepted history for the next 2,500 years, right up through the movies you probably grew up watching. Meanwhile, the actual forced laborers, the war captives sweating and dying in Nubian gold mines, barely appear in the historical record at all. No papyrus documents their strikes, because they had no leverage left to strike with. History remembered the free men who held real power, and mistook them for slaves because the work looked hard enough to fit the story. History forgot the people who were genuinely enslaved almost entirely, because no scribe with a reed pen and a wage ever thought their suffering was worth the ink. So if you had been born in ancient Egypt, your fate hinged far less on morality than on geography and timing. Born a peasant near Thebes in a year of good flooding, you had wages, legal standing, and a body that was mostly your own to direct. Born a captive on the losing side of a border war 200 miles south, you had almost none of that, and no papyrus would ever be written to tell your side of what happened to you. The line between free and enslaved in the ancient world was never as solid as chains suggest. It was written in contracts, in silences, and in the simple, brutal fact of who got to hold the pen and who never did. That's worth remembering the next time a single dramatic image gets mistaken for the whole truth of anything. You already know how the story ends. Chains, a whip, a pyramid rising while you die underneath it. Except the ending was never fixed. It depended entirely on which Egypt you happened to be born into, and on who was left out of the telling.